Mike, over to you. As a councillor and the leader of the council, I think a lot of people would say conventionally you're a very active citizen. So I wondered if you could share with us your citizen story. How did you become such an active citizen?
You'll forgive me, there's nerves here. I was saying to Diane and Wendy earlier on, I'm used to hiding behind either a political thing or an officer speak. So to actually talk about myself is somewhat disturbing.
We're recording this.
I know, that's the point. If I can start, and I did ask Heather how long I'd got, so I'll keep it brief. If I can start, about 3 weeks ago, I went to the Literary Festival and watched Jackie Kay being interviewed by Ali Smith. And it was incredibly moving and very powerful hour and a half. Why I start there is because Jackie Kay's latest book, Mayday, is all about the personal and the political and how they intertwine. And it's linked into that as about grief as well. And it's a hugely fantastic book that I'd recommend to everybody. But it's dominated, despite the elections, it's dominated my thinking over the last 3 weeks because of the power that was evinced by these two women, one of whom from this very ward, talking about their lives. And I think that made me reflect upon, when I was asked to do this, what should I talk about? So, my background, I think you always start with family. My background is Scottish, Catholic, and we come from a family of priests, publicans and postmen. And all three of those jobs at their best, I have to say, I'm not to excuse some of the things that my former faith have done, but all those things are about serving communities. And I think it almost is inbuilt from that time. So that's the first starting point for me. The second, which I can't avoid, is again, I will come back and reference culture on times, Marvin Gaye and the record What's Going On. Yeah. So as a 14-year-old, when I heard that for the first time, as a wee boy, I thought, well, this is a bit different. But the impact it had on me throughout my life has been absolutely significant. And also in notion about the community and citizenship in its widest scale. I still think it's the greatest record ever made. And I think, but it also be for all sorts of reasons. Not just about the politics, but about all sorts of things that then go with that. And again, about the personal. So the personal becomes really important to me. Again, in my journey, I then, after mucking around and in terms of work, I ended up in Sunderland. And again, in terms of my journey as an active citizen, I hit Sunderland at the time the yards were closing. And then to see the impact on communities and what one does for those communities, with those communities. I was a probation officer at the time. And the poverty that had an impact on, but also what it did was offer hope, because I did a lot of work with Sunderland Football Club, who sadly I also still have time for. But they ran a programme called Football in the Community, and they did stuff with young kids. And it was about the power of football in that instance to change people's lives and to make disadvantaged kids and give them hope and optimism for their future. Hugely important, hugely significant, and these things have stuck with me. I think, so within that, as I was a probation officer, I worked in local authorities, there's an ingrained sense of public service, so, and I can't get away from that, so that means to say that I tend to act in quite formal ways, so again, it comes back to structures, I like structures, but I need to break from them, and when I came, after I'd finished work, I came to here. I was in Cambridge, worked in Cambridge for about 10 years, and then after I finished work, people in the room here, Wendy and Diane, got me involved in stuff around Abbey People when they first started up, and that started to ingrain me back away from work into how you operate within a community. Hugely important, because from that I then got involved as a governor at Abbey Meadows, a school that was going through a lot of problems at the time, and we turned that round, which was fantastic. But then, because I'd rejoined the Labour Party, I got back involved in the party. And I think what then made to me was it's about how one operates. So I'm always driven, for me, by community citizenship. And so that's why tonight is quite important. And so for me, it's about how one then feeds back into the communities that you serve in a productive and positive way, in a way that actually means something. And I suppose because I tend to operate, as I say, in boxes, I find it easier to see that. and how I can then transmit what people are saying, which obviously is sometimes chaotic, into something that then we can take forward productively. And the final bit to say is what keeps me going now is people inspire me still. I've mentioned Jackie Kay. There's people in the audience. Anthony Carpen is one that inspires. He won't know this, but his activity for the citizens and the community of this city is fantastic. Diane, Wendy, these are people that keep you active. They keep you going, and they know because you can get continually re-inspired by folk, and that's what helps me. And so therefore to come back to Jackie Kay and Ali Smith, that almost crowned it. So that's my citizen journey, if that's okay. Boom.
Boom, of course it's okay. It's fantastic. Mike, no need to be nervous. Thank you so much for sharing that. That was really, really helpful.
While you're clapping, I think we should clap Heather and the Together Culture Crew. Thinking that before, I was like, we're missing a moment here.
That's really kind. Thank you.
No, this is the stuff.
I love it. And I think there is some really interesting structure, I think, as well, if I put my anthropologist hat on, in terms of what Mike was saying. So he was talking about a journey that, if I'm hearing correctly, started with family and your influence as a family. Priests, publicans, postmen, and then you became a probation officer. So perhaps alliteration has something to do with it as well, I don't know.
In Petersfield.
Yeah, in Petersfield. There we go. And then there were some things about really early cultural influences.
Yeah.
So music, Marvin Gaye, and how that begins to help you understand the world around you. And then some formative year experiences. So when you're starting out in your career and you're in Sunderland, and the yards are clothing, and you're thinking, whew, these are interesting conditions. How do I act within them? What does this mean? And then as that sense of awareness and this sense of what your skills and maybe your superpowers, which is something we like to talk about here, when you identified that, and you talked about your superpower as being you're good with structure, so in chaos, you can actually form some structure. And I think that's really, really interesting, or at least
I'm not sure everybody would agree with that. But,
well, I said it, you didn't. It's what I heard. But you developed this sense of awareness for how you could develop skills that align with your values and your worldview. And then you maintain it. There was something about it's not easy, citizening.
No.
You've got to have some resilience and you've got to be persistent. And so you were talking about connections that you have with other people and people that, a knowledge of people that you know inspire you, and you can seek them out or seek out their work when.
Yes, I think it's about the crack, if you like, what the Irish call the crack. And so for me, a really important part of my life is the Champion of the Thames, which is a pub just around the corner from here. And I know I can go in there and relax, be it by myself and read a book, or have a chat with folk. And it takes you back to, if I'm honest, away from the Labour Party and into real life, if you like, and away from what actually you have the space to have proper conversations with folk.
Thank you. John, tell me, John, what's your citizen story? And also, could you help to reveal, I guess, the abracadabra moments that you had when you started with clarity to be able to see the difference between what you've described as a subject story, a consumer story, and a citizen story? How did that happen?
So it's funny, if Mike's a sort of authentic from the beginning citizen, I'm probably a born again one. So I was all the horrible enthusiasm and of that kind of description. But so I actually started my. So I was at uni. I was at uni here, and I was a rower. I rode Goldie a couple of times back in the day, many years ago. But I kind of went through, if I'm honest, my those years pretty. I'm not sure I liked the guy I was then, if I'm totally honest. And I came out and stumbled into the advertising industry. And I remember the sort of key moment for me was that all I'd wanted to be up until that point was an Olympic athlete, right? Like I was like,
so you were really serious.
Oh yeah, I was pretty serious.
Okay, right,
But not good enough. But I went into the advertising industry, and my first boss described my job to me by saying, what you've got to remember is the average consumer sees something like 3,000 commercial messages a day. And the second part of his sentence was, and you've got to cut through that, you've got to make yours the best. And I was so in the competitive athlete guy vibe that for the first few years, I was like, the second part of that sentence is really interesting. Make mine the best. And then after all, I was like, hang on a minute, did he say 3,000? What? And by the way, this was not to date myself too much, but this was like 2003 or something. So by nowadays, there was a study the other day for certain cohorts that number is up to around 10,000 a day.
Oh my God.
And so once I'd got over myself a little bit and started actually asking questions that mattered a bit more, I was kind of going, well, what are we doing to ourselves when that's the case, right? Like, what are we surrounded by? And I basically got to the point where I was going, well, actually, I think what we're doing is we're telling ourselves we're not good enough to face the challenges of our times. Like we're telling ourselves a story about who we are that's actually deeply limiting. And the framework that I offer, and is sort of haphazardly here and on these little cards for you, is sort of where I got to as the result of a journey that involved fairly painfully stumbling out of the advertising industry and starting to ask another question, which was, what if we put all the creativity and energy that currently goes into selling stuff to people as consumers, like into inviting them into their agency as citizens? Like, what would it look like to make that the kind of the creative challenge? And out of that, the new Citizenship project, consultancy business, was born, and we have this, like, one of the founding questions there was, questions are really important, I think, in this. One of the founding questions there was, we phrased it slightly differently, as why is consumerism made so creative and energetic and participation so boring? And so that's been a big animating part of the inquiry, but over time I began to really kind of dig into the ideas and try and figure out and where I got to, and what's really the book is, and what the work I'm doing now is really rooted in an offer of a way of seeing the moment in time we're living in. And it's an offer that seems to have grabbed quite a few people, and I think it's because what it does is it helps you see this moment as one when it's not a way of seeing the moment that says that everything's all right. It's a way of seeing that acknowledges that things are, like, pretty deeply broken, and we're in serious trouble in a lot of ways. But also a way of seeing that says that actually that's what's broken here isn't humanity, like. It's what's broken is the story that we're trapped in. And so with that, just to set it out a little bit, the easiest way to introduce it is as a sort of quasi-historical framework. So I talk about a shift from end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, we were something like subjects. The right thing to do was keep your head down, do as you're told, get what you're given, on the basis that the God-given few who run society know best, and they'll lead us to the best outcomes for society as a whole. End of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, that starts to fall in on itself. Industrial revolution, rise of the middle class, all of that stuff. Out of the two world wars, we more or less deliberately, more or less consciously replaced it with what I call the consumer story. And so this isn't just about advertising, right? This is about, like, or even just about consumption, actually. It's about a story that says, actually, the right thing to do is to pursue self-interest, to look out for number one, to choose the best option for you from those that are offered, on the basis that if everyone pursues self-interest, that will add up to the collective interest. Like, it's really important to emphasize these are hypotheses about how a good society results, and that's why they're so sticky and trap us so much. And where I believe we are now, and the offer, as I say, is to say, I think we're living now in the collapse of that story, that idea of who we are, because, I mean, we face crises that you can't solve from within that logic. You face a crisis of loneliness and mental ill health, and you can't solve that from within a story that says that humans are independent, isolated individuals. You face a crisis of inequality, and you can't solve that from within a story that says that society is a competition and we have to kind of rise above one another, and that will magic. And most fundamentally for me, we have an ecological crisis.
Sorry. Yeah.
Little punctuation.
Yeah.
We have an ecological crisis, and you can't solve that from within a story that says we're separate from nature and that happiness is the accumulation of material possessions. So you as a result of that, like, these crises are created by the story, and they cannot be solved from within the story. And so we're seeing it fall apart. I would argue what we have today, and we'll come into this I'm sure more, but is what I would call consumer democracy, where actually we're encouraged to see ourselves only as choosing between a fixed set of options and making that choice on the basis of self-interest. That's a phenomenon of the consumer story. And I think in this moment what's possible, and I think what's actually a much older, much deeper, much truer story of humanity is what I call the citizen story. And so if subject says keep your head down, do as you're told, consumer says pursue self-interest, the citizen story says get involved, like contribute your ideas, energy and resources to the pursuit of the best society as a whole, and reinvent the institutions, the organisations, the spaces to tap into the ideas, energy and resources of everyone, create the spaces where that's possible. And that will be how the best society results. That will be how we have a viable chance of facing the challenges of our time, because all of us are smarter than any of us, right? Like that is the deepest truth. We need all of these different wisdoms and experiences and ideas in order to be able to figure out a way through this stuff. And so yeah, I've got very excited all of a sudden. But that, and I could tell story after story about how the Taiwanese beat COVID, and how the Global Alliance for Communities is spreading across the global south. And
people can also read the book.
And you can read the book. So I'm going to shut the hell up.
Yeah.
But that's So my story started, like I say, in the advertising industry, and I think staring at and working within actually a story I believed in as well. And then came to question and come out into a different sort of space.
It's so interesting. There's similarities to the stories as well. There's a sense of emergence. Yeah. There you go. Yeah. Stories are so extraordinarily important. We're all born into some sort of cultural story. I think biologically, it's pretty much a well-known fact that we're conditioned. We've got a neuro imprint when we're born, and that's a story that we are living, and then it's a process to figure out how to change it individually, let alone collectively. So one of the questions that we had for the group was, on your seat, you've got there are some pieces of paper, and there's a list of descriptors of the subject story, the consumer story, and the citizen story. And we'll talk a lot more about citizenship in a minute, but we're curious, are there any examples, are there any things that you've identified in your own life when you're living the subject story, or when you're living the consumer story? I'm making the assumption you're here tonight, so that's probably not the place that you want to be, but if we're honest, do you have examples of subject and consumer identity, or ways of behavior? How are you living that story in your own life?
We sometimes talk in our work about playing a game called Spot the Story. Like, where do you see these stories showing up in how different organisations or institutions or friends or family speak to you, address you? So that might be a way of thinking about it.
That's a great way to think about it. I love it. Yeah.
So I go.
Anybody have any thoughts?
Oh.
I'm sure. Anthony.
Yeah, Anthony Carpenter, local historian.
And Twitter legend. Who I've not met in person as yet, so I'm very excited.
For me, I grew up around here, and I did a degree in, funny enough, of all subjects, economics. And the mindset that John's just explained to all of us was taught to us as undergraduates as if it was a religion. And again, like Mike, I know about religion because I too was brought up as a Catholic, and it really was head down, don't question. They really didn't like being questioned, and the only way, obviously, to pass is to give the answers the question wants. But then 7 years later, and I think this is what moves into the citizen bit, was when the banking crash happened, and I was a policy advisor in the civil service for the housing minister under the Labour government, and it was then that the exposés that several of the textbook authors for my economics degree all had, well, they didn't all have, but several of the key ones had conflicts of interest in reports that they had written saying things like, the Icelandic banking system is wonderful, without actually telling people that they had been paid by the Icelandic banks to actually write them. And I think one of the things that strikes me with the subject was that so many other things, whether it's from the environment, to the societies that we live in, to political accountability and ethics, were all excluded from that. And one thing I've always struggled with, and I think we all as a society are actually struggling with that, and especially within politics, is trying to unpick all of that when we've spent the past 25, 30 years being taught that this is the only way, especially after they fought the Berlin Wall.
Quite.
I'll leave it there.
There's a lovely, just a little anecdote. I can't remember the exact fact of this, but there is definitely an academic paper that I have read that was about like what are the most effective ways to the things that do most to perpetuate the importance of self-interest, and one of the primary ones was doing an economics degree. It's like the people who are most convinced by this are the people. It's like the most effective way to embed someone in the story is to do the degree in it. But the other thing I just want to come back to, like, I think sometimes there's a sense that people think that we therefore need to spend 70, 80 years training people to be citizens, right? And I think the way I would frame it very differently is like, actually no, like, humans are citizens by nature. Like, this is who we are, and and it's more that like this. We just need the social oxygen. We need the spaces and the conditions that let us breathe as citizens, and that's what I think those 3,000 messages a day are kind of choking off. And actually, if we can breathe, then there's a lovely metaphor. Citizenship is a muscle you build, not a cup you empty. And it's like the moment you start to use it, you want to use it more and more and more, and so it doesn't require a mass kind of program to cultivate. It just requires a little bit of space and a little bit of a seed, and this is why I'm so excited about coming to spaces like this. I'm like mega hyper. Anne saw me earlier and I was kind of exhausted, and I come in here and I'm like, yay! So yeah.
That's great. Lindsay, go for it.
I think it's quite tricky. I completely agree with you about us just by nature being citizens, but I think it's harder than you're suggesting to break free of that, because just looking at the list now, the subject, that to me says school. When kids go from their family into school and get taught to be a subject and to behave as a subject and not think creatively and not think for themselves or interdependently. They're not encouraged to work together apart from when they're told to and how they're told
Ironically
to.
enough, yeah.
And how they're told to. So I think actually we all start off being trained as subject from school.
Just to add to that, anyone earning a salary is a subject for most of their day.
Yep.
I think it's well, maybe we'll get into this later. I think it's easier for some people than others. If you're faced with the daily grind of poverty, then that actually dominates rather than, I'm not saying people no, please don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that people who are in poverty aren't citizens or can't show huge amounts of citizenship, but it's harder.
It's harder.
And I think, and quite often I think what sometimes requires the activity is something going wrong. So a good example that's high in my head locally is there's a particular estate in Cambridge called Ekin Road, which has got quite a lot of publicity recently because there's a plan to try and enhance it and improve it. But what's generated the community's interest is the fact that they're concerned about their homes being knocked down. So what you have is that people then become energised and then become massive contributors to that community because something's potentially a threat. And it's so what's quite intriguing is how one's able to translate threat into something positive.
Right.
Which is perhaps, I suspect, where you're going with this, John.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. Like, there's a huge challenge in this, and I don't want to understate that. And it's like the central scenario isn't that positive at the moment, right?
Yeah.
But there are amazing things that are really spreading and growing. The one that comes to mind was you were talking. Check out a thing called Smart School Councils. Have you seen this? It's phenomenal. It's a system. The founding insight was that they were like, kids learn the moment they're in school, that they do as they're told, but also that the popular kids are the only ones who get, like, the most popular kids are on the school council, the most popular kids are on the, and so what they've done with this, it's a kind of software platform, but with a really interesting set of dynamics to it. they've created a system where actually every kid is involved in the school council, and like there are class debates and action teams and communication teams, and everyone finds a role, and these things they sort of come in really cleverly as a how to do your school council differently, but they're actually transforming whole schools as a result. So like these sorts of things are spreading really fast because they're speaking to a moment that I think people are feeling. I mean, in terms of the point about poverty and I totally hear it definitely is harder, and often there is, as you allude to, right, there's most to learn, and as you know from personal experience, often there's most to learn about citizening from people who have least.
And one of the things that I think is interesting, so we're doing some work in Abbey,
Yeah, yeah.
and we've got a project that's going to be called Abbey Voices, and we considered calling it Abbey Citizens, and research told us that that was a really triggering word, because people who have felt disenfranchised feel as though they're not citizens. And so I find that really interesting as well. And the other thing I wanted to contribute in the conversation, and building on the point that Lindsay was making, one of the things that I've found interesting and fulfilling and exciting about Together Culture is over the 7 months that we've been open, really quickly people are reporting a change in themselves, and people are coming here more frequently because they feel safe here. That's the word that they use over and over again. They feel safe to be their authentic selves, and they feel more and more as though they want to make a contribution. But there is also a framework that holds all of that together. And there's also a really explicit culture code, because the other thing that we found that's really interesting is people haven't gone to listening school. People haven't gone to collaboration school or appreciative feedback school. People have learned to debate. It's a zero-sum game. People haven't really learned how to disagree productively or even welcome disagreement, because from tension can come the greatest new ideas. Compromise can be, it doesn't even have to be a compromise. It just has to be something new that emerges, not that anyone is losing. So I find all of that really interesting in terms of how we make something emerge. And just to move the conversation on to the next set of questions or the next topic, if that's okay. We're obviously talking about citizening, and John, you're saying everything is not okay. It isn't. So we can talk about these bright spots with everything being, we can talk about these bright spots, but one of the reasons they're bright spots is, you know, authoritarianism does seem to be on the rise everywhere around us. It's a really scary time. And some of it's by design. John, you wrote in your book, and I don't know if anybody's picked up Alistair Campbell's latest book, but he also references the sovereign individual. And I don't know if anyone's read or is familiar with the sovereign individual, but it was written by William Rees-Mogg, Jacob's father, in the 90s, I think?
97.
97.
Written by a Tory.
The sovereign individual, but yeah.
Hilarious.
Yeah.
A very different man to his son.
Yes, very different.
Yes.
Yeah.
Someone worth knowing.
Thank you.
And the book itself has become sort of a vision statement, I think, for a world that billionaires, populists want to inhabit, and they've been working to create. The sovereign individual, a description of it, and I'm picking this up as a secondary source from your book, John. The new sovereign individual will operate like gods of myth in the same physical environment as the ordinary subject citizen. So the idea being the rest of us are subject to them. And so with that in mind, and I guess knowing that there is, without trying to sound like a conspiracy theorist, people are organizing to make this world evolve. That's just true. Is democracy in crisis, or are we in transition? It could be a bit of both, but I'm just curious. And Mike, from your perspective in local government, I mean, up and down this country, councils are going bust. And I'm making the assumption that financial crisis can't really be divorced from democratic crisis or political crisis. What are the challenges, and also what are the opportunities? Because I also want to say I've been face-to-face and up close to a lot of things that the City Council in Cambridge is trying to do to become more participatory and
Yeah.
to sort of shift the culture.
I think I think the world has always faced difficulties. So that's where I'd start from. I'm not sure it's a new thing. And if you were talking to people in Nazi Germany in 1936, I think they'd probably have a view that the world's actually quite better now than it used to be. I think there's, I'm not saying there's not difficulties, but I would want to challenge that notion that we're falling apart and democracy's over and all the rest of it. And I think there is bad stuff going on. I'm not trying to decry that, but the world has always been difficult, but there's always been optimism as well, I think, and I'd just like to highlight that.
Yeah.
So we can, there's been an awful lot of books about democracy's death. David
Yeah.
Runciman's a very good example, and there's a whole pile of people who've written recently about the end of democracy. Trouble is, we still have elections here. The problem, I think, often is that we don't like the results of the elections, which is a slightly different thing from democracy being dead. I'd also want to distinguish between finances and democracy. I would personally blame the Tories for their austerity over the last 15 years as to why local government is currently struggling financially. But the problem we have to remember is that people voted for these people. And unfortunately, I may not like that, and I may not like what they propose, but the trouble is the nation has done that in the same way that the nation, rather sadly, voted for Brexit.
Yep.
These are things, and it's not about democracy dying, it's about decisions being made that I just don't like, and that's slightly different. Do I think there's grounds for optimism? Yes, I think, but it's difficult in local government, really difficult. We're lucky in this city because I would argue fairly obviously, we've had 10 years of Labour being in charge here. We've run prudent budgets, trying to deliver and to tackle key objectives around tackling poverty and the climate change. But that's because we're lucky, if I'm honest. We live in a city that's booming and we get more money because of that. We've also been clever in the sense that we build, because of our priorities to build council housing, we've gone into a relationship with Hill, which means that we get money from the sale of the private housing, which boosts us against some of the more difficult things that other authorities have to face. I would argue that shows good management. Having so, I would again distinguish between money and democracy, because the money, I think, is to blame from national government and how they've treated local government. So, where am I going with this? I think that there are huge chances, but there are grounds for optimism, and it's about how you maximise those. I think it's about culture, about ethos, about morals. I cannot stand people who do little fibs and then say them often repeatedly, and then they become true. So a great example in the recent local elections, and forgive me for taking that as an example, is that everybody in this city got a leaflet from somebody that's saying that the congestion charge is coming back. Nobody, as far as I'm aware, has ever said that's like to happen. So why was that leaflet allowed to be published throughout the city and delivered in a way that, frankly, I found undermined and corroded democratic? And you're then stuck into a weird world, which we're all referencing Anthony, but you're in a weird world because if you start to deny it, you're only actually playing into a story about, well, there must be something in this story after all. So there's something about how democracy works and how people have a moral duty within that to try and behave ethically. Because sadly, and this perhaps is going back to the dangers that's been expressed, is that people undermine it, and that makes it more problematic to then have an honest and genuine debate.
It isn't one of the problems that not enough citizens actually take part in democracy?
Yes.
You know, what is it? 40%?
And cities, this place is good. I mean, you know, I was talking to some friends today that we were talking about earlier on, and you know, 25% is an average in their city, and you're thinking, oh boy. And if you don't have to go very far into the Fens, whereby you have one candidate and 20% of the people vote, and that tells you that democracy is really in problem. So what am I trying to say here? I think one has to energise people. One has to find ways of energising people, which I think is what you're suggesting. And the trick is, how do you do that? without pandering to
You can
the
make it
lowest
easier
base.
for them to vote.
Well, that again, I would argue, I wouldn't disagree with you at all. That
You're going to let me go? You're going to let me go? What's going on here?
Yeah. Yes, and no, I'm coming, and I'm going to say one thing before
Okay.
I turn it over to you. I'm sorry, but so there's something really interesting in what's being discussed, and I wanted to do a segue because we've been talking about citizening, and the identity of being a citizen is something that has to emerge. It's not necessarily there. And Mike, just to go back to your point about citizens in 1936 Nazi Germany.
Or Russia or whatever.
The segue, yeah. Well, the segue that there, I've also been reading a book, and it does sound dark. It's called The Crises of Democracy by an NYU professor called Adam Przeworski. I hope I got that right. But he's helping us to read the patterns of how people behave in different situations, emotions, feelings, thoughts, and actions. And he talks a lot about Germany in 1936. And what he's saying is the Nazis weren't necessary, it wasn't predetermined that that was going to happen. That we always have to consider that it's conditions don't determine the outcomes, but it's the actions of people in the conditions that determine what the outcomes are going to be, which I think is part of the point that you're making as well. And so I just wanted to lead into your response, John, to that question as well, in terms of if you're looking there at the citizen or at the conditions of citizening right now, what are the choices that people are making? How is the citizening aspect of democracy evolving? What we understand democracy to even be.
So this is really interesting because what I don't want to do is come across as like saying I don't think saying I fundamentally disagree, but I do see things pretty differently actually. And I want to tell you about. Does anyone know what happened in the Argentinian election at the end of last year?
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't, John.
So I'm going to tell you, Claire. I'm going to tell you. What happened in Argentina at the end of last year was they ended up in a presidential runoff between two candidates. One of the candidates, Sergio Massa, was the finance minister in the existing government, which had basically fucked it, right? Like they were deep in recession and all sorts of trouble. He was the finance minister in that government. The other alternative was a man called Javier Milei, who his actual nickname is El Loco, the madman. And he turned up at an actual election rally with a chainsaw.
Hand to his face.
The choice that the Argentinian people were making is, I mean, it's, and I share this story because it's an archetype rather than because I think like, but I think every country pretty much in the world is going around this cycle, and I think we have a bit of a different vibe in the UK right now because frankly we put the Muppets in charge and they failed, and we're going to move in a different direction and we might have a chance. But all we've got a chance, in my view, of is we've got a window, because a friend of mine put it the other day. He said the next Labour government is going to have to fulfil promises it's currently not brave enough to make. And if they don't, then we're going to be very close to that sort of scenario. I mean, what they had in Argentina is what they've got in the US. Arguably, it's what's going on. The Polish came very close. Like if you look across the board, I think we've got a situation where the way I see it is that where we're ending up is that because too many of the people in positions of power and influence in our society, I would argue, can only actually see two stories of democracy. They can see a story of democracy that is consumer democracy, where you compete for the vote and you try and and it's all about the vote in the election. Yeah. Or they can see the rise of authoritarianism, and they see their role as being to protect what we have from what is rising. And what they don't see as a result is that actually there's a whole very exciting, very powerful way. And I know actually you guys are doing a lot of this stuff, so I'm not saying this as a kind of, but it's the opportunity of evolving our democracy into a much more participatory, much more open, much more dynamic frame is, I think, essential, actually. I don't think it's a kind of, I was talking to someone the other day who used the metaphor of vitamins and painkillers. And I think too often in our democracy, we too many of the people in our democracy see participatory democracy, participatory budgeting, legislative theatre, citizens' assemblies, all of these kinds of dynamics and mechanics, they see them as vitamins, and they're not. They're like essential painkillers. But until we need to be able to see that they are critical if we're going to really step into them and move into a different mode of democracy that is far more resilient. The problem, and I think you're actually referring to this in some of what you say, two problems. One is that if we don't sort of, elections are so vulnerable as kind of weak points, and that they are attracting all of the energy of bad actors. And if once they win, they're in, because it's such a binary kind of moment. And secondly, I think the risk is, and again, I don't mean to pick on anyone or whatever, but like the risk of like blaming people for not voting, like too little has changed for too many people for too long, like, and too few of their votes actually carry meaningful power. And this isn't an argument for PR, like whatever. I'm talking about like how we create the systems and structures that actually enable people to have meaningful agency. And these things are like, Nigeria crowdsourced its law for startup communities in 2022. Paris now has a standing citizens' assembly as part of its governance structure, 100 randomly selected Parisians representative of the city population on all key demographics, including refugees and migrants in the calculation. That's effectively the upper house of the city. Milan and Brussels both have similar structures, specifically on climate. Manchester's, like, we are doing some of it. Like Manchester used legislative theatre to develop the homelessness strategy and involved huge numbers of people with lived experience of homelessness in that process. But we're doing it in, like, pretty much every country in the world is doing participatory budgeting in all of it, in most of its major cities. Like China has an extensive participatory budgeting system. We are pretty much the only country that doesn't really do it very much. Like it's kind of. And so I just want to, so again, I'm getting overexcited and my head up, but it's like this isn't a moment, I don't think, where, I do think I think this moment is different. And maybe I think we're in a time where actually, like really fundamentally, we're in need, like I think the institutions of the consumer story, the ideas out of which they were created all originate in the post-war period. And I think we're in need of a moment of institutional renewal on that scale.
I wouldn't disagree with that. I think it's slightly different from what the notion that we're messed up. I think I perhaps am being half pint full, in that I think there is the examples that you give. Like, you see, so on one level you could talk about Trump and Biden all we like, but then we're talking about Paris at the same time. So what I'm saying, I'm not sure we're that far apart. It's about how you then change the activity here to bring in. I would say Germany. I think things are going. There is genuine democracy there. There is problems there as well. There are problems. No, but there are problems. I'm not saying that. Yeah. But then there are bad people here as well. So it's just how you then take forward the ideas that you're propagating. I wouldn't disagree with them, but it's how you then manage to take them into power. And as I say, there's interesting things in Manchester that I think can be looked at and taken up. And that notion about driving things locally, I don't think is necessarily a bad thing.
I think there's something, just as a reflection in the conversation, that was quite interesting, is when we were describing and talking about citizening and acts of citizening. It's interesting how it got a bit disconnected from democracy. Somehow they were two different things. And so what I thought I might do is take us back. John, I'm going to read, I don't know if I should do this or you should do this, but a description of citizens from your book. And if you folks could consider it and think if you relate to this description or this identity of being a citizen, and then maybe think about any tensions or barriers that exist from you doing this. Because all these ideas are fantastic, but how do we make them emerge? And then how do we shift our main narrative so that we're acting as citizens? Should we try it? Okay. Are you okay for me to read it?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So, John writes, citizens are humans who want to shape the world around us for the better, and who claim, and where necessary demand, the right and the means to do so. To be a citizen is to care, to take responsibility, to acknowledge one's inherent power. To be a citizen is to cultivate meaningful connection to a web of relationships and institutions. Citizenship benefits from a free and expansive imagination, the ability to see things, the ability to see how things could be, not just as they currently are. To be a citizen implies engagement, contribution, and action, rather than a passive state of being or receiving. So the question was, do you see yourself, can you relate to that description of being a citizen?
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely. And I think it's really hit the nail on the head for me. The trouble is we're fighting the tide, aren't we? We're living within a society, democracy arguably, which seems to have all these really ugly binaries of rich and poor and black and right and wrong, and it's all distracting us from the fact that we just need to be contributing, we need to be helping more. And that every piece of sort of folklore, every piece of field research tells us that we could if we wanted to. Like if every one of us, for example, thinking about the probation service, if every one of us befriended somebody who's currently in prison, we know that people who are befriended when they're in prison come out and are much, much less likely to reoffend. We know that. It's absolutely proven research. And yet we don't do it. So it's almost as if our social behaviours have broken down because the model itself has broken down.
Interesting that you mentioned behaviors. Yeah.
But I think that's partly because of the consumer story we've been living in, isn't it? Because we've been sold the story that we are, what we want is the most important, that trumps everything. And that, you know, as they say in advertising terms, because you're worth it. And it's like, I don't think what I want to do as an individual is more important than my place in my local community and in society. And it's that shift, isn't it? And I think if we're coming to the end of, hopefully we're coming to the end of the consumer story, and if that means coming to the end of consumerism as well, then it's going to happen anyway, isn't it? Because you're going to have a load of billionaires, but you're going to have a whole load more people who've got no money to spend. So, it will be forced upon us, but hopefully we'll be able to do something about it before then.
I'd say that there's something on top of that, which is exactly spot on with the consumerism, that you can read as, so what's in it for me? Because doing something, if you want to do something like in a citizenry way,
It's a verb, it's an adjective, whatever it is, go for it.
The thing is that you do it because it's you do it like pro bono, or you do it as almost an act of charity. So like I was saying, I've been doing some cleaning in my road and my road and stuff like that. That's because to help the council not to spray stuff, and so we take up on us to do something that we voted the council to do, because we think that council can't do it. So it's just like we do things in spite of, and that makes you feel good at times because you are generous, but it makes you feel also like you are the ones like ruling out a little bit because you're doing that. So there's this kind of thing, which is this conflict there of again, and from the consumerism viewpoint, which is why am I doing something which is which costs me more money, which costs me time, which costs something, and that no one cares about,
right?
Or
it feels that way. John,
Can I just because it triggered a thought for me, which is, and at the same time, the consumer story, you're going out and buying shit and actually paying for it. So you may be picking up litter for free, but the consumer story, we somehow have got this idea that actually we're gaining, when in reality you're literally paying money to be a part of it. Really interesting.
Clever stuff, isn't it?
Yes, Dave. No, I'm just trying to. I think Lindsay's hand was, and I saw you as well. Can I do over here and then back over this side?
Go on, Lindsay.
Lindsay.
I think also so many of us spend so long within a subject environment that probably we feel disempowered empowered. We don't actually feel like we can make a difference, we can get involved. And I think, I have read your book. I do wonder whether a lot of people at the moment need an enormous push to get involved. Like the examples that you've used, all of those people were in situations that were so, like, what else could they do? They had to do something. Whereas probably most people, we're stuck in the consumer story where we're working and spending and working and spending, we don't have the time. So it takes something huge to make you stop and then reconsider. I think having all those things at play make it really, really difficult to do what actually you instinctively want to do, to find the time to do that, to find the confidence to try it, the situation to really push you into that action. Yeah, I don't know, that's just my thought. It's,
Yeah.
it's
I think
also
like
to
the
connect
whole system is just not in our favor if we want to be citizens. Like the
It's-
community spaces are dying. I cannot imagine.
It's true.
How,
Yeah.
Obviously.
Yeah.
Like, can you imagine if someone pitched an idea to create a library right now, like this free space with books that will come, buy some membership and then they can rent it,
Yeah.
I'm
then
working
can
on
hang
it.
out
That's
there.
me. This gentleman in the front, you've had your hand up for a while.
This actually picks up on that last point to some extent. It's interesting to know what people think about removing the option to be a citizen. So I think some of the examples you gave before, maybe Paris, and I've read before in examples in Australia of citizen juries. So if you take away that idea of we're relying on the people who are moved to do this, and just say, okay, it's almost like a responsibility to do it, and in that way you start to normalise that behaviour. A lot of what we're talking about seems to be about almost like the Overton window, about what seems radical and then becoming kind of normal and expected. So if you not just encourage people to do it, but give an expectation that people are going to do it. I think it's referring to another book, I think it's called The Future of Everything by Tim Dunlop, and he talks about this. And at the end of End State as well, with James Plunkett, I think, as well. So there's, what's your opinion on just trying to encourage that grassroots emergence of it, or just sort of saying, right, everyone's expected to do it?
And let's get to that in a second.
Okay.
But let's hold on to that because we're gonna jump into what we can do in our own sphere of influence. But I know there are 2 more people chomping at the bit. Oh, 3 actually. Let's give them space to do it. Michael, I think you were next, then Dave, then the woman behind you, and then we'll move on.
I think complexity gets in the way of citizenry as well. I'm not going to
Sorry, can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. I think complexity. I think complexity gets in the way of citizenry as well. Like, I'm not going to name the name of the councillor that I met, but he openly admitted to me that the current way the Cambridge City Council works wasn't particularly clear to him at all, and he didn't quite know how to fully navigate it, even though he'd been working in it for a while. And I think everyone that comes to like try to solve a problem finds that they hit a complexity or like a technical snag or something that blocks them from moving forward. I'll give you an example. I'm part of ACORN, which is a community union. We're trying to get bus franchising enacted in the city, and my understanding is that it's quite a massive bureaucratic mess at the moment, like some of which is completely understandable because my understanding is the council is trying to avoid being taken on by a stagecoach and other companies and being like told to go back to court and go through lots of other messes, but it blocks you when you want to enact an initiative, and that's all I'm going to
It's hard, isn't it? Let's have Dave.
I do think the status of loneliness that comes from those experiences, I think isolation and complete impotence in this. But how many people give blood in this room? Thank you very much.
How many people give blood?
Pardon?
Is that how many people give blood?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't.
Well, okay, but you know, people do. People give blood.
Yep.
I'm involved in the biggest, infected blood inquiry, which is being delivered next week. In fact, the final report after 6 years of waiting, after 40 years of incidents of that privatisation of a service that was available here. So those are the dangers. I don't want to go into that, but I think it's fantastic, absolutely fantastic that people give blood.
Great.
And I think if they can do that, the one little thing, get rid of the cross, make the voting ballot a tick, not a blank.
Okay. Great. And I'm just going to, the woman in the pink shirt.
The lady in the flowery shirt was first.
Okay, all right, thank you.
I just wanted to emphasize the point about corporate power in all of this. So this has come up occasionally, that we'll have a world of billionaires and all the rest of us with no money. Actually, we'll have probably just enough money through something like universal basic income, which is a very popular strategy in California, because us being consumers is beneficial to corporate power, and until we recognize the kind of size of the opponent, it doesn't come out of nowhere. So we feel tired and busy and all of that because we are on social media all the time, because it's addictive and it's been designed to be that. So until we recognize that, we don't stand a very good chance.
Yeah.
And then the last contribution, and then we'll move on. Yeah.
So, I'm really sorry, I haven't read your book.
How very dare you. Yet, good word.
But I was just wondering about the relationship with citizenship and positive psychology, because we know that the foundations of positive psychology are all around positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning and accomplishment. Well, that to me sums up citizenship. And with the level of mental health issues across the world, actually, if we're looking at what we all need to promote positive mental health, citizenship surely is the answer, or one of them.
That's excellent. Yeah. Absolutely.
Can I don't know if you want to move us on.
No, feel free.
I think the gentleman's point is really interesting about the complexity of it, and I'll give you an example. It's going to be a local example. Mill Road for People has done a fantastic job in advocating for the closure of the bridge, which is something I support.
Don't say closure.
Sorry. It was shorthand. Edit, please. Shorthand, and that's a very good example of a citizens' initiative. But is Pam Wesson's taking the county council to court, having the opposite view, a good example of citizens' behaviour? Because I would argue that she's just as entitled to do that as we are to advocate for the reverse. So what you get into is that complexity, because what happens is, Tony Blair said this years ago, it's great asking the people what they want. The trouble is they don't always agree. And that is a perfect example of which is good citizenship and which is bad citizenship. I know I'm with you, but Pam surely is entitled to go through a court process.
Yeah, but they have such a weird view of
But
democracy.
you can't. But that's
Democracy is not
no.
about
But
numbers.
no. The point I'm trying to make is that she is acting as a citizen.
Yeah.
And we may not like what she's proposing.
Yeah, I get that.
We may not like what Mill Road traders are saying, but she's still acting.
So
as a
I'm going to
citizen.
tell a couple of stories. The first is the £1 Million Mayor. Does anyone know this story? So
Tell us that.
I'm going to tell you that story. So this is the mayor, and this is £1 million in weight, not money. £1 million mayor of Oklahoma. The story goes he was diagnosed as obese. While he was in the doctor's surgery, he picked up a magazine, had a list of the fattest cities in America. Oklahoma was third on the list. His response was to say, not to say I'm going to go on a diet. He said, let's go on a diet. Like, let's lose £1 million in weight together as a city. What that did was it created the collective agency, which I think is the antidote to what you're talking about. If we only see what we can do as individuals, which is unfortunately, I'm afraid, what most of our institutions leave us thinking about, then we don't feel we can do anything commensurate with the scale of the challenges we face. What Mick Cornett did in Oklahoma was he said, let's do this together. And he used his leadership position as a facilitator, as a connector, as a mobilizer of a movement. transformational results, like weight loss groups all over the city. At one point, the CEO of Taco Bell flew in to discuss changing Taco Bell's nationwide menu. They decided that they needed to invest in healthy infrastructure, because actually, like, they got to a certain point, and then they were like, we're fat because we have to drive, and so he raised the penny in the dollar sales tax that would be hypothecated for healthy infrastructure. Had to do it through referendum passed with a massive majority. Now, the point I'm making with this is that it is not about, and this is why I emphasise the way and talk about the current state of democracy the way I do. It should not be incumbent, and because if it remains always incumbent on citizens, then it has to get to a point where things are so shit that I can't not act. Which you're exactly right about. But the people who are in positions of power and influence in society can create the conditions that mean that we have collective agency. And unless they do that, then they are, I would argue, failing in their duty. Now, the counterpoint to this, and this thing about negative, like bad citizenship, should we say, like one of the most profound and like troubling experiences in the research for the book, and it's really weird because I'm always the like optimist, and like today I feel like I'm being the negative dude, and it's really an odd situation for me. But I think for all that I am totally in, I'm with you, I love you, let's do this. Positive psychology is great. And I think we're in a moment where the challenges of our time are huge. And if we pretend that they're not, then we're actually like, we're ignoring people. We're ignoring what's going on inside people, particularly young people, right? Anyway, so the story, the thing that really tripped me in the research for the book was I decided I wanted to understand QAnon. And I went in and the QAnon conspiracy theory. So if you saw the January 6th Capitol riots, did you see this when they were rioting saying that Trump actually won the US election in 2021? Wise lady. There's this whole thing called the QAnon conspiracy theory that I can't really explain in full now, but it's basically a kind of a weird far right kind of thing where people are tempted to believe, for example, that Biden stole the 2020 election, and there was a big insurrection essentially, and there was a guy with bull's horns and a thing who was known as the QAnon shaman inside the Capitol.
Trafficking children into slavery.
It's all crazy shit.
Hillary Clinton was trafficking children into slavery in a pizza parlor in DC.
A whole conspiracy theory vibe. And you go into this thing, and the entry moment is you are needed here. Here's your first task. Here's the contribution we need you to make. We can only save America together. It speaks to people as participants who have collective agency. And the the nutters, the people who want to destroy this, I'm slightly tired, so I'm like not mincing my language this evening, and I apologise. But this is why I say, unless we open some of these systems up, have a citizen's jury, pick a random selection of people, let them deliberate on it, let them hear the witnesses and come back. And I know there are reasons, specifics are, but the point I'm making is the institutions have a duty to open these systems up and create new ways of doing things. Yeah. And we have been doing a whole load of work, and I don't know Cambridge City Council, I'm not throwing stones or anything, but in council world, there is a real problem with this idea that people are consumers, basically, that the role of a council is to provide services, the role of people is to use those services as customers. And the actual outcome that they're trying to avoid in that situation is people is like being blamed. There's a whole different world where what you're trying to do is say, how do we work with people to make the places we live better? How do we create these structures and processes that actually involve and engage, that create the collective agency to do this stuff? And again, I don't know enough about the local context, so I'm not, but that is a fundamentally different frame. Like council in the subject story is a local authority, right? Council in the consumer story is a service provider. What is a council in a citizen story? We don't really know yet, and that's a really exciting question, and it's also an urgent question.
I think that's a great question. Can I hold that there, and I just reflect a few things back to the group? So I heard from the majority of people gathered here was that some of the things that are prohibiting us from fully embracing this identity individually or as a group as being active citizens. And active citizens that if you look at the list up there or on your seat down there, there are values that drive it and certain behaviors that drive it. So there's a certain degree of consensus that would emerge around this is what we are as citizens. So there's something about our mindset shifting that I heard people talking about that would enable us to truly embrace being a citizen. I heard people talking about social norms, that there's some sort of doing citizening needs to be something that becomes normal, that you see lots of other people doing, so that you're more inclined to do it, and you don't feel odd, or you don't feel as though I'm the mug here because I'm doing something and nobody else is doing it. And there's something about psychology and well-being and actually having the resilience to be able to feel as though that the contribution you have to make is of value, that there's something that you can do, that it will be appreciated by others, that you actually do belong with a group, so somebody wants you to make a contribution in the first place. These are some of the things that I was hearing from everyone, and that we have different barriers to behaving in this way and believing and identifying as being a citizen based on what our situation is in life. And there's a whole lot of complexity around it. And the gentleman in the front asked the question about grassroots. So we've been talking a lot about the institutions and how institutions can help to create the conditions where the citizen story can be the story that we predominantly live. But that takes time. Somebody also mentioned the Overton curve and how all of this, if we don't elect plonkers, but we elect people who want to move in this direction with us, it's still going to take time for big change to happen. So what is it that we can be doing now within our spheres of influence to start breaking down these barriers that we all face so we can get onto citizen?
Can I just say one word on this, which is like you're already doing it, right? Like that's why I'm here, because this is that kind of space, and so I just want, like, don't start from a kind of, oh, we're bad, like what can we do? Like you're doing it, like, and do more, but like start from good.
To your QAnon point, the thing we keep, our 4 values are turning up, helping others, experimenting, and collaborating. And the thing I keep telling people over and over and over and over and over again is don't diminish how important just turning up actually is, because the more you turn up, it's all of this stuff. It's all the stuff that's in our heads. It's all of the social norms that we have to shift. That's the starting point. And the more people who just turn up, that's the beginning.
I also just want to be really clear, sorry, and I know you want to hit it, but I don't mean to make my kind of emphasis on institutions and the role of institutions and leaders a disempowering thing. That is absolutely the opposite of my intention, and absolutely the opposite of what I believe as well. Like, there is such power and essential work in this, and in finding one another and meeting one another and starting to build, because the systems, the structures, the institutions are going to find it hard. Like, they're trapped in these stories as well, right? And only if they can see, people in those institutions and organisations can see what's possible, will they be able to open them up and shift. Both are needed. And the most crucial work, I would argue, is really outside. But it's not about, but we can't let ourselves, like, I mean, this is like the edge of my work at the moment. It's like, people are asking me as I'm going around the world and doing stuff, like, how do we actually make this happen? Because the central scenario doesn't look great, right? And the thing I keep saying, I feel like I have to emphasise, is we need to organise, we need to connect up, we need to get involved. Everyone can do that from where they are, and that grassroots organising is the without which nothing. If that doesn't happen, there's nothing for institutions to open up to, right? And it is also true that the institutions need to open up. And I don't want to I neither want to disempower nor oversimplify. So that's why I'm saying what I'm saying.
I think that's entirely legitimate. I think the bit that in Heather's feedback that I heard was about what John said was about responsibility of institutions to open up, and if they don't, it becomes a con job. But if we talked to Dom earlier before about we had a fantastic citizens assembly around congestion, and the GCP spent a fortune on it, and then we ignored it, every single bit of it, and it was a brilliant piece of work, entirely done as one should, but when it came to the crunch, it was, I have to say, ignored. And so therefore there's something in the point, I don't think we thought we disagreed, but I don't think we were. The point is that if we set up that delegation of responsibility, you have to honour what you say, otherwise the thing becomes a waste of time, and actually again undermines democracy. So it's a counterintuitive thing. So it's fascinating how I think, and obviously I would come this from an institution, the institutions have responsibility, if they're genuine about democracy, to delegate that authority accordingly and stand by that.
I think, and I would love to put it out to the group because I thought this was a great question. Anthony, I'll get to you in 1 second. See you. It really, really does bug me that the council is called the local authority. It drives me nuts, this idea that there's an authority over me. Like, what on earth is that? How did this happen?
Anthony will know.
Okay,
that's Anthony, he'll tell you.
Let's not, it'll have something to do with the subject story. The question, however, is, in a world where we are in more of a participatory relationship with the council.
Should be.
Yeah. What would it be called? What's the council called? If it's not our local authority, what is it?
Council's a pretty good word.
Just be the local council?
But a council is also, it does sort of, it's
But you can be
this body of people that has power over somehow.
I don't know, I kind of feel like I'd be part of the council.
Yeah?
Admin.
But the thing is, it's an authority because it has democratic legitimacy.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I suppose what I think's been a bit missing really is that actually there are differences of opinion, and we're not very well trained at how to manage those. And actually, once you get lots and lots of people participating, they don't always agree, and so there's a really important piece about learning how to manage that constructively.
That's excellent, Sean. I love that. And maybe that's one of the roles becomes more of the role of the council.
Well, I would argue that's what we do anyway.
Yeah,
That's why we're democratically elected to do. We have to make
Yeah.
difficult decisions when everybody doesn't agree.
Yeah.
And that's what we do, I have to say.
I'm with you. Yes.
Well, you said that's what we should be doing. That is what we have to do. And that's just part and parcel of life, I'm afraid.
No, it's good. I think what we're hearing and experience is that people don't all necessarily feel like they've got a voice in that conversation.
That's true.
There's that. Yes.
So we've been talking about, or you've been specifically talking about democracy quite a lot, and a few other people have mentioned it, and as if it's a monolithic thing. And I think it's important to recognise that, like, elections and representative democracy is actually quite a consumer thing. Like, it really is just to post it, and it feeds into the local authority vibe. And by not naming different, like, representative democracy is what's sort of dying and has been subverted by authoritarianism, and participatory and deliberative democracy is what's coming in, and hopefully patches some of the holes that are being exploited by that. But by using a single term, like, it's really hard, like, people are not always talking about the same things, and until you name the beast, you can't slay it, you know?
Yep, that's excellent. Anthony, yes.
Looking at, I guess, an overall solution or a starting point, and I went through all of the local political party manifestos for recent elections, and not one of them mentioned civic or citizenship education. And one of the things that I think we need to start planning, I've spent the past 6 months running workshops on this under the title of the Great Cambridge Crash Course. Learning the basics about politics, because the root of all of the things that Heather, John and Mike have been talking about comes back down to this concept of parliamentary sovereignty, the concept that at the next general election we will all, who have the right to vote, and there are people who don't have the right to vote, will be making a preference, indicating our preference on ballot papers for who should be our constituency representative. Now, that Parliament can legislate for anything it likes within the realm. It cannot be bound by the decisions of a previous Parliament, and it cannot bind the decisions of a future Parliament. So the problems that Mike has been talking about Local Government Finance Act 1984, that's one of the reasons why he can't whack up the rates to pay for all the nice things that we would like to have. Local Government Finance Act 1989 is one of the reasons why we can't have, for example, other forms of taxation, for example, taxing the wealth. Local Government Act 1988 is one of the reasons why he has to outsource so many things, because Parliament is sovereign and the governments of the day tabled the legislation which was enacted by the MPs. So actually part of the problem, and one of the things we're thinking about when we're moving from consumer to citizen, and it was my former permanent secretary told me this, is there comes a point where you actually have to say one of the solutions is change the law. And one of the things that, and I've been coming to workshops like this both inside my civil service days, because I've been through with the former Minister for Housing taking a bill all the way through its stages in the Commons and the Lords, and that's where you find out whether corporations really have the power. Is basically identifying which are the changes that are needed in order to enable, for example, participatory budgeting. Mike probably doesn't have the powers as a council leader to do the sort of participatory budgeting that Paris has. The United States, for example, has a constitution where local government and state government is protected. We don't have that. You either have a codified constitution where your tiers of the state are protected by a constitution and a constitutional court, or you have what we have, which is parliamentary sovereignty. And so one of the things to discuss with the parliamentary candidates coming up is what changes to the law do you want to see to, for example, enable how Cambridge is governed, council, however you want it structured, for example, to be able to tax the wealth and pay for new nice things.
Thank you, Anthony. Thanks very much for that contribution. Do you have any thoughts?
Well,
Are there any laws that you'd like
the
changed?
risk of getting into trouble, as Diane will point out, we have more powers about participatory budgeting than we may let on.
Huh, that's really interesting.
And that is quite interesting. Diane and I first met years ago in Huntingdon, where she did a fantastic project of participatory budgeting on the Oxmoor estate, which also demonstrated that you can do it with people who have very little money, and so you can engage communities effectively. And the numbers of folk that came to those was significant. So it's about, you can delegate power if you work hard enough at it.
I think there's something for me around a little bit like what you were saying, which is start somewhere, almost anywhere. Think about where there might be pots of money, where there might be more flexibility. So it might not be kind of big, enormous public budgets, but actually, there's often pots of money where we could do that in a neighbourhood or in Abbey, and all of these kinds of things. Where I think I suppose I really reflect on who is making decisions about the things that happen in people's neighbourhoods. Is it the people with lived experience who choose where public money goes? Where money goes to community organisations, and it's just redressing that balance a little bit and saying, well, actually, rather than having a panel of professionals deciding where that money goes, why don't you just open it out in a public meeting? I mean, it's not that hard. You can do it with ping pong balls. I mean, you know what I mean? I suppose it's just like, you don't have to overcomplicate it, and it can be, £2,000, £5,000, £10,000. Like, start somewhere and get into the habit of it, and then see what a difference that makes to people in terms of their own agency and the fact that they're actually making a direct decision about something. I mean, it's not rocket science, but it is sort of rocket science because everybody's a bit scared of it.
Thank you for that. And with an eye on the time and the eye on the heat, it might be time to start just bringing this to a close. So the last question I'm going to ask everybody, and Mike and John included, is in 10 years' time, if we are living in a world, in a city where citizening is the cultural norm, how do you think your life would feel different or look different? What would be different about it? John?
Lots more conversations with people in the street about stuff that matters to us.
Yep. Lots more conversations. And
I was going to say exactly the same thing. You just said exactly what I was going to say.
And I must admit, just building on what Siobhan was saying earlier, maybe conversations where you disagree, but that's okay. Is I don't want to put words in your mouth. Yeah.
I think maybe just a more positive vibe. Generally, I think people feel that there's something wrong.
Yeah.
As you said, but they just can't quite put their finger on it, and I think that would dissipate that sense.
Yeah, maybe if they spent less time in front of a screen and more time having a chat with each other. Simple things like that.
Fantastic. Any other? Yeah.
Maybe when at meetings, networking things like this, when you ask them, well, what do you do? They automatically apply what they do for their paid job, but if in the conditions that you're describing, that might not be the case. They might say what they do outside of their work first.
The thing that, whatever their passion is.
What brings you alive?
Oh, that's nice. Yeah. Anthony?
One, we would all have more time during the day for all of this. Now, for some of us, that might mean negotiations with employers. In terms of policy change, that might mean something like universal basic income, so that you don't have to work such long hours just to pay your rent, for example. And the second one is we would have far more individual and collective knowledge about how our city functions. And that would involve building and bringing in structure, systems and processes for citizenship learning, whether it's at school or whether it's through adult evening classes, for example.
Great.
For me, I think it'd be also a place where you'd prepare for an election. Or you wouldn't prepare for an election. You would be in contact with your local,
whatever we're calling
elected
it.
Or whatever you call it exactly. I wasn't sure what I call it.
No, it's fine.
And you're just excited by reading the manifesto instead of just, I'm going to read all the manifestos because I want to make sure that I'm okay.
Yeah.
And reading them, you're like, I can't really see the difference in all of them. I can see a bit of this, a bit of that, but that's not mentioned anywhere. But this idea of like, at any point in time, you can have people you can exchange ideas, debate, and French influence would be great.
That's
also, I think it shifts a lot of people's thinking to kind of present and future, or people will be thinking about the what if or how might be scenarios rather than retrospective nostalgia potentially.
Changing frame of reference, Bisha, go ahead. I don't think you said anything yet.
I think it would change how the value of money, like how we see like currency and how we utilise money. Ideally.
You love it? Yeah.
The number of advertising messages we see.
Coming full circle here. Yeah. Mike, how about you?
Without what you're saying, I'd change the question to our life rather than my life. So that's the starting point. And as I think for me, it's about again keeping it simple, more participation. But that then implies a responsibility for others to make it better and easier to participate. Yes.
John, how would our lives be different?
Oh God, so many ways. I mean, in some ways, I'm like, I sort of less want to cast out into the future and more like I'm thinking about things like smart school councils and the idea that like every day you would feel there would be some manifestation of having some agency to shape the world that you're in for yourself, like. And that doesn't have to mean making a decision, but it should mean like providing input to something, or telling your story in your own voice, or like being able to gather data for something, or like contribute your ideas to something, or like there would be an ongoing like, there would be a sense of a kind of ongoing inquiry. I love your how might we, like there's a sense that we are, places feel like, so in Grimsby, which is a town I've become super attached to through this process.
That's where I'm from.
Top man. There's a lovely organisation that's grown up over the last few years called East Marsh United.
Yeah.
Do you know these boys?
Yeah.
Girls, everyone. That is, I was just thinking of two particular people who I met. But the work of East Marsh United is basically, I mean, the language says it, right? The language of United. Like, how do we make the East Marsh a place where we're proud of together? And it started with litter picks and then moved on to be a 6-monthly arts festival called the Sun and Moon, and now last year they ran a £500,000 community share offer, which is enough in Grimsby to buy 10 houses on the worst street in the worst neighbourhood in the worst town in the country, refit them using good local jobs and let them out as a social landlord, providing a sustainable revenue stream for the rest of the organisation. Like that. And now an old son of the town has come back and brought the controlling stake in Grimsby Town Football Club, and now the football club is an anchor institution in the town, and they're starting to work with local businesses, and they're carrying them as a shirt sponsor for no fee because they're kind of a power building organisation rather than and like that kind of energy builds and builds and builds, and it starts somewhere. I love what you were saying. Like it starts somewhere. You start using that muscle. You start creating the opportunity for people to use that muscle. And then it builds and builds and builds, and that spirit of like, this place is an open question that we're holding together. And our elected representatives are holding that question with us. They're important in their role as leaders, but they're not just doing it for us, they're doing it with us, which I know is language that you use widely and love, so thank you for that.
Am I sorry? Am I to just? I don't want. No, it's to agree, and I'll go back to the theme. In the initial questions you asked us to look at is what gives you hope for the future. Yep. I was going to say Cambridge United Football Club because of what they do is outstanding, and their commitment to the community that they serve, I think, probably has echoes in what John's just said, and their work as a community foundation and what they hope to bring to this city is significant.
And Stockport are going to beat them next year.
I was talking about Stockport afterwards. My mother-in-law's from Stockport. So
maybe on the note of Stockport.
It's the future.
Well,
no one saw this ending there.
No one did. Oh, and
one of the things that John has kind of skirted around is that there are lots of stories of individual pockets of action and great stories of people doing things in their local community, being local citizens. But one of the things that's really exciting me is connecting those individual pockets. So if someone in Australia has a question about how do I do this, someone in Cambridge who has that skill and knowledge and has already done that kind of thing can be connected. And can answer those questions, and that's kind of the work that John is just tipping into at the moment.
This is Anne's coaching of me. If you want to know more about what I'm up to, I have a website, just my name.net on the end, johnalexander.net. There's a mailing list at the moment, but where we're evolving to with some support from the ultimate connector here, who is the reason I'm here, is we're evolving it towards more of a kind of peer-to-peer community where this kind of learning is possible. And I'll just leave, I'll shut up. The thought I want to leave you with is there's a profound quote that's really stuck with me. Amazing queer black thinker in America called Adrienne Marie Brown, who has this lovely phrase. She says, "What we don't need in this time is more mile-wide, inch-deep change." We've tried that. What we need in this time is inch-wide, mile-deep change that schisms the existing paradigm, and then we need to connect that up.
That's a brilliant note to finish on. And what I did want to say from the purpose of connections, we have a recently elected Democrat in the New York State Legislature who has joined us tonight. And we've got a community activist in Venice. and a couple of other community activists in New York who are here building connections and learning about what's actually happening in Cambridge as well. So
New York's participatory budget, the city's participatory budget has just launched. They have an artist in residence who has created a campaign called the Sunnies. You must look this up because it is so cool and it's utterly beautiful. So just so you know, another thing to ref.
Brilliant.
Go NYC. Or NYS, whatever.
NYS, but yes. Anyway, thank you to everybody for joining us this evening and for participating in this conversation. I hope everybody is walking away with a little bit of hope and certainly a bit of a future backwards vision about a more connected world where we all have a lot more agency. And I think John really poetically quoted Adrienne Marie Brown, but don't stop believing in yourselves.
Journey. Don't stop
journey.
believing.
Be awkward. Be uncomfortable. Be the person who steps outside the social box and the social norm. We need you to do that like there's no tomorrow. And come back to Together Culture. You're all invited on the 22nd of June. We are having it's a Saturday, and we are having a big celebration of our neighborhood. The Kite, Lele, who's sitting over there in the amazing hat, is going to be, together we're going to be creating a carpet out of flowers that she's been foraging for weeks and sharing with us a summer tradition from Catalonia. Anthony is going to be running a number of tours about the history of the kite and exploring our heritage. We started this in January for some reason, and a lot of you missed it on a cold evening in January, so we're doing it again in the summer. And if anybody's interested in what's happened with the Citizen Studio, well, we will be revealing all, and that's the day that we're going to be announcing what the priorities are of the membership, and a whole bunch more is going to happen. So
Woo!
Come to the party. You're all invited.
Do it.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.